Picture this. A quiet morning at the docks, workers laughing, kids walking to school, and life ticking along like any other day. Then, a fireball erupts into the sky. A shockwave obliterates everything in its path. And within seconds, Texas City is plunged into absolute hell. Buildings collapse, bodies vanish, and an inferno rages out of control. But this isn't a freak accident. It's a ticking time bomb, triggered by a chain reaction so deadly it turned an entire town into ash. And here's the kicker. This never should have happened, and it's maritime mysteries. And today we will uncover the story of a disaster so catastrophic, it was felt 250 miles away. This was the moment Texas City became ground zero for one of the deadliest industrial disasters in history. And as we peel back the layers of this horrifying event, you'll see how one small fire on a single ship unleashed hell on Earth. Stick around, because what happened next is something you won't believe, and it could still happen today. It was the morning of April 16th, 1947, just another day in Texas City. The Gulf Coast port, 40 miles from Houston, was a roaring beast of industry. The air throbbed with life. Cranes screeched as they hauled massive cargo. Diesel engines growled, and dock workers barked orders, their voices cutting through the salty breeze. It was the beating heart of America's industrial machine, a juggernaut of post-war progress. This was where America fueled its ambition. Crude oil, gasoline, and chemicals poured through its veins, destined to power tanks, cars, and cities, essentially pumping lifeblood into the nation's booming economy. To its residents, the port was their pride, their identity, their everything. But beneath the roar of progress lay a dangerous secret. The massive volume of hazardous materials flowing through Texas City made it a silent powder keg. And on that seemingly ordinary morning, one spark would turn this industrial titan into a city-wide inferno. The SS Grandcamp, a French-registered cargo ship, sat quietly at one of the docks. She wasn't glamorous. She was a workhorse, her purpose purely functional. Her mission? To carry agricultural goods, industrial materials, and relief supplies to post-war Europe, still recovering from the devastation of World War II. On this particular trip, she was loaded with 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate, a common fertilizer that was also highly explosive under the right conditions. For dock workers, it was just another shipment, one of many in a port that handled countless tons of volatile materials every day. Even though the SS Grandcamp was just one of thousands of ships that passed through Texas City, it would become the rock that shattered the port and the town itself. What seemed like an ordinary vessel, sitting quietly among the chaos of industry, was about to become the epicenter of a nightmare. The day had barely started when a thin wisp of smoke was spotted curling out from the Grandcamp's cargo hold. No one could say for certain what caused the fire, and to this day, the exact reason remains a mystery. It wasn't panic-inducing. Yet. Fires on ships were rare, but not unheard of. Dock workers moved with a practiced calm, dousing the area with water in an attempt to smother the smoldering flames. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that water alone wouldn't save them. The ammonium nitrate in the hold had already begun to heat up, and water would only worsen the reaction. Inside that dark, sweltering hold, the ammonium nitrate was transforming. As temperatures climbed, the fertilizer began releasing gas, creating a ticking chemical time bomb. Workers on deck had no idea of the danger below their feet. As smoke thickened and heat intensified, they tried everything. Dousing the fire, sealing the hold, even using steam to suffocate the flames. But the ship itself had become a furnace. The cargo hold turned into a pressure cooker, and the conditions were now primed for an explosion unlike anything the port, or the country, had ever seen. Meanwhile, the town carried on. Families ate breakfast. Children laughed on their way to school. Dock workers continued loading other ships, their attention divided between the Grandcamp and the usual frenzy of activity. Few realized how dire the situation had become. Even as the fire grew, the Grandcamp's crew believed they could salvage the ship. By mid-morning, the smoke had turned from a wispy warning into thick, billowing plumes that climbed into the sky. The acrid smell of burning chemicals wafted over the port, turning heads but not yet sparking panic. Then came the fateful moment. Someone noticed a strange sound emanating from the hold, like a faint hiss, almost a whistle. It was the ammonium nitrate, releasing gases under immense pressure. For the men working nearby, it was the final warning. But by then, it was too late. The blast launched chunks of the ship thousands of feet into the air. A fiery mushroom cloud, 2,000 feet high, rose over Texas City, visible from 100 miles away. The shockwave obliterated everything within a half-mile radius, flattening buildings, tearing apart ships, and vaporizing workers who were unlucky enough to be close. Steel beams twisted like licorice sticks. Windows shattered as far away as Houston. Dock workers were thrown like rag dolls, their bodies hurled hundreds of feet. Cars, trains, and equipment were tossed into mangled heaps of smoldering metal. The ground itself quaked, leaving cracks in the earth as if it were recoiling from the force of the explosion. For miles, the blast wave smashed through homes and businesses, leveling entire neighborhoods. The roar of the explosion was deafening, a sound so thunderous it was heard over 150 miles away. And yet this was just the beginning. The Grandcamp's explosion was like a match dropped in a tinderbox. But this tinderbox wasn't confined to the ship. It was the entire port, the surrounding industrial complex, and the very fabric of Texas City. The initial blast unleashed chaos on an unimaginable scale, setting off a chain reaction that turned the port into a living hell. The high flyer, docked only a few hundred feet away, was the next victim. Loaded with its own deadly cargo, tons of ammonium nitrate and sulfur, it became a time bomb that the explosion from the Grandcamp had already lit. The fiery debris raining down from the Grandcamp ignited the high flyer's deck, and within minutes, its hold was engulfed in flames. Smoke poured into the sky, thick and black, marking it as the next inevitable catastrophe. Dock workers scrambled to tow the burning vessel away, but the line snapped under the strain, leaving the high flyer stranded like a condemned man waiting for execution. But the disaster didn't stop at the high flyer. The shockwave ripped through the port like a battering ram, smashing into everything in its path. Nearby oil storage tanks, filled to the brim with crude oil and gasoline, were torn open like soda cans. Rivers of flaming fuel spilled out, surging through the port and igniting warehouses, pipelines, and machinery. The heat was so intense, it melted steel girders and turned equipment into pools of molten metal. Buildings along the waterfront disintegrated in an instant. The grain elevator, one of the tallest structures in the port, collapsed like a house of cards. Entire warehouses crumbled, burying workers under tons of debris. Train cars, loaded with chemicals and industrial supplies, exploded like firecrackers, sending shrapnel in every direction. Pieces of rail tracks were found twisted into knots, hurled hundreds of feet away by the force of the blast. The residential areas of Texas City weren't spared either. The shockwave ripped through neighborhoods, blowing roofs off homes, shattering windows, and knocking families off their feet. The blast was so powerful that it lifted cars off the ground, flipping them like toys and crushing anyone inside. Children playing in their yards were thrown against walls or buried under falling debris. Streets were blanketed in ash, shards of glass, and smoldering wreckage. The sea itself seemed to rise in rebellion. The blast sent a massive wave rippling across the harbor, tossing smaller boats into the air and smashing them against the docks. Some fishermen out on the water were blown from their boats entirely, plunging into the oily, fiery waters of the port. And yet, the destruction didn't end there. Fires erupted across the port and surrounding industrial facilities, consuming everything in their path. Chemical plants, packed with volatile materials, began to erupt one after another, each explosion adding to the inferno. Plumes of smoke and fire lit up the sky like a scene from the apocalypse. By the time the high flyer finally detonated, hours later, it unleashed a second shockwave that compounded the devastation. The second blast was nearly as powerful as the first, ripping apart whatever remained of the port, scattering debris for miles and triggering even more fires. The explosions were so immense that pieces of the Grandcamp and high flyer were found miles inland, embedded in the ground like meteorites. The once thriving port of Texas City was now a war zone, a wasteland of fire, ash, and mangled metal. And the worst part? This chain reaction of destruction wasn't over. It was still spreading, still consuming everything in its path. For the survivors, there was no time to grieve, no time to comprehend the scale of what had happened. The only choice was to run or burn. Survivors described scenes straight out of a nightmare. Parents ran through collapsing buildings, screaming for their children. Dock workers, their clothes scorched, staggered through the wreckage. Fires raged for hours, creating a heat so unbearable that people were forced to dive into the bay to escape being roasted alive. One survivor recalled being thrown hundreds of feet by the shockwave, waking up in a sea of smoke and rubble. Another described a colleague who was ripped in half by flying debris. It was chaos, it was carnage, and it was far from over. Amid the chaos and devastation, when fear would have driven most people to run, heroes emerged, ordinary men who did the extraordinary. Dozens of first responders ran toward the Grandcamp that day, knowing they were walking into danger. They were facing the unknown. They had no guarantees of success, no promises they'd come out alive. Yet they went, again and again, battling flames, smoke, and chaos, because that's what humanity is at its core, the ability to act selflessly in the face of unimaginable odds. Their actions teach us a powerful lesson. Being a hero isn't about glory or recognition. It's not about being fearless. It's about choosing to do the right thing despite the fear, despite the uncertainty. These men were ordinary people, firefighters, dock workers, sailors, who refused to stand idly by. It reminds us that in the darkest moments when all seems lost, humanity's light shines brightest through those who choose to step forward. Their legacy lives on in the lives they saved, and the example they set for generations to come. The burning question that echoed through the ruins of Texas City was, how could this happen? How could a single fire ignite such catastrophic destruction? Investigations peeled back the layers of this disaster, and what they uncovered was infuriating. The answers weren't buried in mystery. They were written in negligence. The ammonium nitrate, a ticking time bomb in itself, had been stored in conditions that practically invited disaster. Packed tightly in burlap sacks, the cargo sat in a dark, sweltering hold with no ventilation. The heat from the Gulf Coast sun turned the ship's hull into an oven, slowly cooking the volatile chemical until it became a spark away from destruction. And yet, no one, not the workers, not the ship's crew, truly understood the danger. There were no warnings, no clear protocols, no recognition that they were handling a substance capable of leveling an entire city. When the fire was first spotted, the response was a tragic mix of desperation and unpreparedness. Water was thrown at the flames, an instinctive reaction that only made the situation worse. The crew tried sealing the hold, suffocating the fire, unaware that the chemical inside was generating deadly gases, building pressure with every passing second. The most terrifying truth, this isn't a relic of history. Ammonium nitrate is everywhere, still widely used, still ticking away in ports, warehouses, and ships around the world. Accidents involving this volatile chemical aren't rare, they're shockingly common. The same explosive force that obliterated Texas City in 1947 has shown up time and time again, leaving death and devastation in its wake. From massive factory explosions to port disasters, like the 2020 Beirut blast that killed hundreds, ammonium nitrate continues to prove just how deadly it can be. It's not history, it's a warning. Did we miss anything? Could something like this happen again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hopefully, I'll see you in the next one.